RMI 2009 has been aptly named Reinventing Fire, and it's the title of the bold new initiative to synthesize the 27 years of RMI's work and thought leadership on the efficient and restorative use of resources, and to create a roadmap for how the US and the world, indeed, can move away from fossil fuels entirely and towards a world of very high efficiency and renewables. It's doable, and this conference is a way to initiate a new level of conversation about how to make it happen. And of course, in RMI's fashion, the idea is to use business logic in real-world solutions. RMI is not a think tank, it's a think and do tank. And so we think the four sectors of building, transportation, electricity, and industrial processes can be transformed by reinventing what we think of and what we use as fire. And as Marty said, something different from just friction. So we invite you to enjoy and join these discussions as colleagues. And we ask that you insist that the panel contribute to answering the question and each call to action. If they get off topic, please interrupt. We really do not require or want a very high level of politeness here. It's a little late in the game for that, we think. So, that is now indeed enough introductory fol-de-rol. And I would like to introduce Lionel Boni, who is the director of the Office of the Chief Scientist. You can have two guesses as to who the chief scientist at RMI is. Lionel works intimately with Amory, and he will introduce our first plenary on a topic that we found everybody wanted to hear about and not enough people are speaking intelligently about, and that is where nuclear fits in the energy equation going forward. Thank you very much. I'll be back after lunch to give you some directions about our breakout sessions. Lionel, are you close by? There you are. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for being here at RMI 2009. As Peter mentioned, my name is Lionel Boni. I work at RMI, where I am the director of the Office of the Chief Scientist, Amory Lovins, and I am very honored to introduce this distinguished panel on what the role of nuclear energy may or may not be in fixing the climate issue. I'm not just honored, but I'm also very interested because, as you can tell from my accent, I grew up in a country where 80% of the electricity comes from nuclear, so that country is France. And in France, we grew up hearing that nuclear energy is the greatest thing in the world, probably even greater than having 400 kind of cheeses. So when I hear that on this panel, some people may not necessarily agree with that view, I am very, very interested to hear what they have to say. So the format for this panel is going to be first two 10 to 15-minute presentations, one by Amory Lovins, the other one by Rosner. And then Scott Sagan and Peter Darbee are going to join the discussion. So now bear with me if you don't understand what I'm saying. I'm going to read the biographies of the participants, and I'll try not to butcher names too much. So the moderator is going to be Scott Sagan. And Scott is a professor of political science at Stanford University and the co-director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation. Scott also serves as co-chair of the Global Nuclear Future Initiative of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Before being at Stanford, Scott was a lecturer in the Department of Government at Harvard and served as a special assistant to the director of the Organization of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon. Scott also acted as a consultant to the Office of the Secretary of Defense and to the Sandia and Los Alamos National Laboratories. He is the author of Moving Targets, Nuclear Strategy and National Security, The Limits of Safety, Organizations, Accidents, and Nuclear Weapons. That's a long title. And is also the author with Kenneth N. Waltz of the spread of nuclear weapons, a debate renewed. So Scott is going to be the moderator of the panel. The first panelist in alphabetic order is Peter Darbee, the chairman of the board, chief executive officer, and president of PG&E Corporation. Since becoming CEO in 2005, Peter has spearheaded major new initiatives to establish PG&E as an industry frontrunner in customer satisfaction, operational excellence, and environmental leadership. Peter has become known as one of the industry's most active leaders on the issue of climate change, energy efficiency, renewable energy, the smart grid, and other aspects of energy and environmental policy. Next panelist is Amory Lovins, chairman and chief scientist of Rocky Mountain Institute. Amory's work has been published in 29 books and hundreds of papers, and it has been recognized by, among other things, the Blue Planet, the Volvo, the Onassis, the Nissan, the Shingo, and the Mitchell Prizes, a MacArthur Fellowship, the Heinz, Lindbergh, Right Livelihoods, National Design and Technology, and World Technology Awards, and Amory advises governments and major firms worldwide on advanced energy and resource efficiency. And he's also a pretty nice and wonderful boss. Final panelist, Rob Rosner, is the William E. Rather Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago in the departments of Astronomy and Astrophysics and Physics in the Enrico Fermi Institute and the Computation Institute. Bob recently stepped down as the director of Argonne National Lab and was founding chair of the DOE National Laboratories Directors Council. Although Bob's academic research is mostly in theoretical and computational fluid dynamics and plasma physics, his research has also been heavily involved in a variety of research and policy issues related to energy production, as well as to nuclear safety, nuclear security, and non-proliferation. And Bob is currently on a sabbatical at Stanford University. So we are ready to hear the first 10 to 15-minute presentation by Amory Lovins.
Thank you very much. I'd like to talk about nuclear power's competitive landscape. And what I mean by that is deciding what are its competitors, because the view in the nuclear industry, the conventional theology, is that what it's competing with is other central power plants, chiefly coal. And in this view, efficiency and renewables are worthy but really won't amount to a great deal. And the variable renewables, wind and photovoltaics, can be excluded from a major contribution just by definition because they're not considered reliable supply, what's called in the trade baseload or 24/7. As I'll suggest, that's a misuse of terms. And in this view, of course, carbon pricing benefits nuclear because it makes coal power and gas power look more expensive. Based on observed market behavior, I have a different and perhaps heretical view that the main competitor nuclear needs to worry about is not other big power plants, because they're all losing in the market to efficient use of electricity and what The Economist magazine calls micropower, which is partly combined heat and power, making or co-generating electricity and useful heat together in factories and buildings, and renewables other than big hydro. These are winning big in the market, as we will see, basically because they're cheaper, but they have other nice attributes, and carbon pricing benefits them equally, or for fueled cogen almost equally. So it wouldn't change their balance against nuclear. Now, just to summarize, first, the competition from end-use efficiency. This state, of course, since '75 has held per capita electric use flat, while per capita real income went up 79%. That saved the state about $100 billion in capital investment in the power system. We found going state by state and adjusting for economic mix and climate, that if the U.S. used electricity as productively as the average of the top 10 states, that would save 5/8 or so of coal-fired electricity in the country. McKinsey found this year that efficiency can very profitably save half the coal electric output by 2020. The utilities think tank in Palo Alto, EPRI, found in 1990 that the U.S. could profitably save about 40 to 60% of its electricity by 2000, or in 2000, and the average cost would be about 3 cents a kilowatt hour. That's much less, of course, than the delivered cost of electricity made by a free power plant. We found an even bigger long-run potential, about 75% at 1 cent a kilowatt hour. The difference turned out to be methodological, not substantive. Nationwide, utilities are often saving electricity for about 1 or 2 cents a kilowatt hour, the best for less than 1 cent. Of course, these savings keep getting bigger and cheaper because the technology improves faster than we use it. Now, even if you don't price carbon, many renewables can also compete with new central plants today. Here's an eye chart from the financial firm Lazard. Don't worry about the fine print. This just shows cost going from left to right, increasing, and the bars at the bottom are for central power plants, and the ones at the top are for renewables, or the last one for efficiency. These are compared all at the bus bar, that is, feeding into the grid, and actually some things like photovoltaics and efficiency are already delivered to you, avoiding their delivery costs, so that gives them another advantage not shown here. We can quibble about the numbers, like the actual market wind prices are a good deal lower than shown and nuclear is higher than shown, but the general shape of the chart, I think, is quite clear that most renewables are already at or below the cost levelized over time of equivalent power from new thermal stations. Now, that is reflected very strongly in what the world market is doing. This graph shows how much electricity micropower is producing worldwide. The brown part at the top is cogeneration, mostly in industry, mostly natural gas fired, and it saves at least half the fuel cost and money. And then the colored wedges at the bottom are all the renewables other than big hydro. Well, it turns out that micropower already produces, even 3 years ago, more electricity than nuclear worldwide. It's making 1/6 of the world's total electricity, 1/3 of the new electricity, and from 1/6 to 1/2 of all electricity in a dozen industrial countries, not including the U.S., where it's 6%. That doesn't count saved electricity, which looks comparable or perhaps larger in annual effect. And when you add those up, it's obvious that central stations, which we're told are indispensable, have less than half market share now because they cost too much and have too much financial risk. In contrast, micropower is, in general, privately financed. Last year, just distributed renewables, the colored stuff at the bottom, got $100 billion and added 40 billion watts. Nuclear, as usual, got zero private equity investment and added zero capacity. In 2006, nuclear did add 1 plant's worth of net capacity worldwide, more than all of it from upgrading old plants. That was less than photovoltaics added. It was 1/10 what wind power added. It was 30 or 40 times less than micropower added. China's nuclear program 3 years ago was 7 times smaller and 7 times slower than its distributed renewables program. In 2007, China, Spain, and the U.S. each added more wind power than the world added nuclear power, and the U.S. added more wind power than we'd added coal power in the last 5 years combined. In 2008, as global distributed renewables added about 40 billion watts, the U.S., and for the second year in a row, Europe, added more wind than gas capacity, and China doubled its wind installations for the 4th year running. They beat their 2010 wind target last year. They now look set to beat their 2020 wind target next year. Nuclear capacity and output last year fell worldwide, and for the first time, in probably a century, renewables got more investment than fossil-fueled power generation. 11 September this year, Harvard and Tsinghua researchers published a nice paper in Science showing that China can get all of its electricity, not just the growth, but all of it, at least through 2030, cost-effectively from wind power. Now, here's the short version of what's been added to the grid year by year, and you notice that wind in red, photovoltaics in blue are standing up on end, and nuclear is gradually grinding to a halt. Now, it's quite true that the average capacity factor for U.S. nuclear plants is about 90% lately, less over life, less in the world. Distributed renewables, about 40%, so you have to adjust for that if you're looking at energy output. Now, I think the main reason that nuclear is not going anywhere is it costs too much to build. And you can see the escalation in real capital cost, constant dollars. There are two kinds of numbers here. The ones in italics are so-called overnight cost, and the ones not in italics are what a utility actually pays because it has to suffer some escalation and pay interest during the construction period. And you can see that there's on the order of a threefold escalation of capital cost in the past 5 years or so, as widely reported in the financial press, and it's essentially similar across other countries as well. And there are complicated reasons for this, and the main reason for the difference in estimates that we hear today is that the low ones are at variable cost, whatever it is, you'll pay us, and the high ones are at firmer fixed costs that put the cost risk on the provider, not the buyer, and naturally that's bid much higher. So I think a reasonable conclusion from this, and honestly said by the head of strategy for the World Nuclear Association, is that it's completely impossible to produce definitive estimates for new nuclear costs at this time. Now, only central planners are buying nuclear plants. There are no at-risk private equity investments. And then, of course, the capital market's been in such a mess, nobody's able to build big plants anyway in market economies. Now, we've done quite a careful analysis based on observed market costs and prices of different ways of providing new electricity delivered to the customer, whether from nuclear or coal or combined cycle gas or firmed wind power. Firmed means you can have it any time whether the wind's blowing or not, or different flavors of cogen or efficiency. And there are different components. Notice this is delivered to your meter, so there's a red bar in there for delivery from central sources, but not from on-site sources because they're already delivered. A lot of people are still using numbers like the old MIT study from 2003. There was an excellent industry-dominated study a few years later at Keystone that went higher. The current estimates are somewhere up around here from industry, from utilities that are actually trying to buy nuclear plants and financial analysts. And you notice nuclear is awfully expensive compared to the other stuff. Well, that's reflected in its ability, its limited ability to save carbon. Yeah, it does save carbon, but if you turn the price, the cents per kilowatt hour, upside down to look at how many kilowatt hours you get for $1, and then you adjust for the carbon released by methods that do release carbon, like some kinds of cogeneration and combined cycle gas, then you get how much carbon can you save net by displacing coal by putting $1 into different options. So nuclear maybe used to be here, and now it's maybe around here, similar to a combined cycle gas plant. Not a very effective way to save carbon. You save more with wind or with cogen recovering waste heat, or lots with efficiency. In fact, the average national cost of efficiency is already up in the ceiling, and in terms of effectiveness of saving carbon per dollar, and the cheaper programs are way up in the next floor of the hotel somewhere. So what this means is that, yeah, you can save carbon with nuclear, but it saves you about 2 to 20 times less carbon per dollar and about 20 to 40 times slower based on the observed deployment rates than if you bought efficiency and micropower instead. In fact, if you bought a new nuclear plant instead of efficiency, you'd end up releasing more carbon than if you'd spent the same money buying a coal plant instead. Now, there are a number of conservatisms in this analysis that I needn't go into now, but they are each very large and collectively dominant. And in fact, Tom Dinwoody's done a nice analysis showing that even photovoltaics, the costliest of the renewables, beat a coal or nuclear or gas plant by the time you can build it. They beat it in cost, they put more peak output, and then you can rebuild it about every 20 months. Now, the question of reliability often comes up because we don't want to have the lights go out, as has happened. But there's kind of a funnel that tells you that this is not a terribly reliable resource, and even the well-designed build and run plants that put out about 90% of their full-time, full-power output in this country do have certain disadvantages. They shut down about a month odd every year and a half for refueling. They're prone to things like heat waves, drought, and mass shutdowns. And after a sudden shutdown, they cannot rapidly restart for physics reasons, so they're unavailable when you most need them. But it's important to understand that every kind of power plant is intermittent. That is, sometimes it breaks without warning. And some kinds, wind and photovoltaics, are variable. They fail because of weather, but you can predict that. There is actually no necessity for power plants that run full time. I'll get into that in a second. But also remember that 98 or 99% of power failures start in the grid. So if you want reliable power, you should make it at or near the customers and bypass the grid. So I think at the core of a lot of the nuclear debate is a confusion about what's baseload. Some people use the term to mean steady demand, some the cheapest resource, some the cheapest to run resource, but in common parlance it means a big power plant, and for nuclear advocates it means a hypothetical power plant that runs all the time. There is no such animal. A typical coal or nuclear plant is shut down about 11 or 12% of the time, and several percent of the time it's shut down, often for a long time, 1 billion watts at a time without warning. So we have to understand that being able to meet steady demand does not require a steady generator. There isn't such a thing. Utilities combine different generators through the grid. Steady output is a statistical attribute of the totality, the aggregate of generators on the grid. It is not a physical requirement for, and it's not an actual attribute of any single generating unit of any kind. Utilities have been doing this for over 100 years. It's well understood. But the notion that any unsteady plant is no good for keeping the lights on is an utter fallacy, and John Wellinghoff, who spoke last night at a special event here, understands that very well. So the competitors are very, very large resources. I already mentioned efficiency. Global wind is about 35 times global electric use, even more when you make the towers as high as they are now. Lots of wind, over twice as much as the US and China use. Just the wind power stuck in the interconnection queue to displace half our coal power. Putting solar cells on 7% of the structures in this country could provide all our annual electric use with no land. And we could get rid of 1/3 of the coal power overnight just by running more the largely idle, efficient gas plants and the coal plants less. And that would cost a small fraction as much as new nuclear builds. So where's the nuclear renaissance? From August '05 for 3 years, we had the most robust capital markets and nuclear politics in history. We had new subsidies equal to or exceeding the total construction cost of new nuclear plants. We still have those subsidies on top of the old ones. There were 33 proposed new nuclear projects. None of them was offered a penny of equity capital in those conditions. Very interesting. Yeah, there are 52 plants under construction worldwide as of about 2 months ago. Well, 13 of them have been under construction for over 20 years. 24 have no official start dates. Half of them are late, often substantially. 36 are in just 4 countries with centrally planned systems: China, India, Russia, South Korea. All 52 were bought by central planners. 0 are normal competitive free market purchases. And I think further falls in nuclear capacity are inevitable at least through 2015 and could barely be stabilized thereafter, perhaps by heroic building efforts, even with license extensions. You can see why in my last two graphs here. We're getting a little bounce in nuclear plants entering construction, but compare that to the historic rates of construction, and you see it really doesn't amount to much. It's less than in any year from 1967 to 93. And here's the retirements, because that big bulge of construction is now reflected in a big bulge of retirements coming at us. And you can postpone the net decrease a little bit by license extensions, but not much. So that, in sum, is why the German environment minister said there isn't a nuclear renaissance. The only thing frequently revived is the announcement. He published a major study, which I commend to your attention, the World Nuclear Industry Status Report, showing the number of old nuclear plants that are decommissioned worldwide is greater than the number of new ones taking up operation. We don't have what it takes even to stop the downward trend, let alone increase the number of reactors. So he concludes all the facts, and I would say economics first, are in favor of phasing out this technology while at the same time expanding the use of renewables and energy efficiency. Thank you. And I have the honor and pleasure now to call up my fellow physicist, friend, and colleague, Bob Rosner, to give possibly a different view.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. As you might imagine, I definitely feel like I am the lamb in the lion's den. But then, I'm used to being the entertainment.
There are quite a few nuclear accidents.
So I'm going to talk about nuclear. Let me just say at the outset that I'm not going to be saying, just let's do nuclear. That's not my position at all. And I think most people in the United States, I think realistically understand that when we talk about a renaissance, that renaissance in things nuclear will not happen, and it certainly is not happening in the United States for a number of reasons. So I thought the first thing to do is to talk about some truths. First, about some truth about me. So I was the director of Argonne National Laboratory. Argonne grew out of the Manhattan Project, the weapons program. It was the place that the United States government, the Atomic Energy Commission at the time, designated as the lead lab in the United States to found the commercial nuclear power industry. And there are some comments I want to make about that. One of them is that has to do with the kinds of things that you heard from Amory, which are basically very negative issues about nuclear. And quite frankly, I agree with most of them. And the reason is there is a kind of a psychology at work here. If you think about the people that founded the modern nuclear age on the commercial side, they were the folks that came out of a very successful weapons program. They were people with an enormous amount of hubris. And I think those folks thought that it was perfectly obvious that they're going to be successful because they had been successful. They, I think, hugely underestimated the risks. I think they hugely underestimated the complexity of what needed to be done in order to have safe, affordable nuclear power. And they completely underestimated the possible public reaction when things went awry, which they did. So if you ask yourself, why is it that today we're staring at a situation in the United States where things nuclear are viewed by and large by the public in a very negative light? It very much has to do with how that field got started. So I just want to tell you a little anecdote about another field that you're familiar with that had the same problems. It's called the aircraft industry. In the 50s, the beginning of the jet age, two companies were in the forefront. One of them was a British company that flew the Comets, an American company, Lockheed, that flew the Electras. The Comets had the feature that the fuselage would disintegrate in flight. The Electras had the feature that their wings would fall off. For industries that depend on a sense of public awareness that these are safe means of transportation, I would say that's bad news. So what was the reaction of the industry? The reaction was to fix it. I think no one today gets on an airplane and thinks, gee, the wing is going to fall off, or gee, the fuselage is going to disintegrate, even though it did on the Hawaiian flight, right? We don't think that way, and the reason is because the technical problem was understood and was fixed, and that required investments. You can ask yourself what happened in the United States in things nuclear. The answer I'll show you at the end was to go exactly the other way, to basically stop investments altogether. So it's no wonder that we are where we are today. So let me just say in brief, where do I differ with Amory and where do I agree with him? I think both of us have an enormous amount of faith in technology, that technology really is a way of getting us out of the jam that we're in terms of climate. I think where we differ is that he is much more of an optimist about the non-carbon renewables. I'm much more of an optimist about nuclear. And I think that is the typical nuance that we're playing here with. So we both have the same problem, actually, when we actually face things in the public realm. I took the liberty of taking a Doonesbury cartoon, and let me just read it. It says, I narrowed down the options to alternatives that cost too much and others that won't work. I didn't do any basic research. It's more of an experience sort of thing. Next week, I plan to think about the options of using technology that isn't yet available. So when Amory talks about RMI being a place that is a think tank that then does, that's a very important point. The does part really matters. It really matters. So you just need to know where I'm coming from. I call it conservation. Amory calls it efficiency. I think we're talking about the same thing. If you want to spend $1 and want to get the biggest buck out of your dollar, what you ought to do is think about greater efficiency, period. But then why are we talking about nuclear at all? I'm going to give you really three reasons. One of them has to do with what some people call energy security and global energy demands. These are issues that are primarily, I think, not American issues. They are issues elsewhere in the world, and I'll get back to them in a moment. Second issue has to do with climate change. And the third has to do with something that's not often mentioned in this kind of context. But we care a lot as Americans about the availability of high enrichment uranium, stuff that can be made into bombs elsewhere in the world. For a nation to speak in the international forum knowledgeably and persuasively about these issues, that there's a requirement that that nation also have the capability, the technical capability, of actually playing a role. And one of the greatest worries that I personally have is that if it is really the case that the United States gives up on civilian nuclear power, we will be in the position of not being credible on the world stage when it matters, when we talk to the Irans, the North Koreans, and so on and so forth. So this is a very important role. At my lab, Argonne, we have a coterie of nuclear engineers, people who know how to build and design plants, who have gone over the last decade to the stans, the states of the former Soviet Union, to decommission or to modify their test reactors that use high enrichment uranium so that they use instead low enrichment uranium. It's a very important issue because having that kind of material in a place like Kazakhstan is not a good idea. So my bottom line is I will never claim, and I will not stand for the proposition that nuclear is the entire story. It's part of a larger solution. Efficiency is part of it. Renewables is another part. It certainly is possible that nuclear plays in the commercial world, a large role. You already heard about France. I'd like to talk just very briefly about the state of Illinois, where I live. 50% of the power in Illinois is provided by nuclear power, and it is the cheapest of the energy sources that the utility in Illinois provides. And just as an aside, roughly 50% of the material, the fuel that goes into the Illinois plants that Exelon uses, happens to be downblended uranium from the former Soviet weapons program. So this is truly turning swords into plowshares. Now, let's just be clear about it. The folks that think that nuclear is an interesting possibility are not just the wild-eyed folks that have always been pro-nuke. There are folks that you've heard of who most people would consider Greens, who think that climate change is such a crucial issue that you need to play safe and allow for the possibility that some of the other fixes will not work, and you should at least think about nuclear. There are scientists who are skeptical, who started out skeptical. I was a skeptic when I first came to Argonne as director, as chief scientist first, actually. And I've changed my mind. I think it is a viable issue. And then you need to think about why it is that countries that you would normally not think of as inherently pro-nuclear. Think of Japan, the country that suffered the most because of the dawn of the nuclear age. Finland, one of the Scandinavian countries that you would not think is a rabidly pro-nuclear country. Abu Dhabi, which I think has a lot of solar. Those countries are not just thinking about going nuclear, but they are going nuclear. And you have to ask yourself, why is this so? And that's the question that I want to address. So some of it has to do just with some sobering facts. I think there's no question that actually doing all the things that are needed to be done now in order to prevent an average surface temperature rise on this Earth by more than 3 degrees is difficult. It's challenging. And the longer we wait, the worse it gets. I think everybody's aware of that. So the challenge is we need to do everything possible now, not next year, not 2 years from now, but now to affect that. And I will tell you right up front that nuclear is not the solution to that problem, because nuclear takes quite a while to actually get going. There's no question that nuclear is not going to play a role in affecting climate change over the next, say, 2 or 3 decades. It might play a role, and this is really the long-term vision, once we get to the latter part of the century. Now, what are the positive things you can say about it? First of all, even though Amory doesn't like the word base power, some folks don't like base power, the fact is that in the United States, the availability of nuclear plants is, in fact, the average availability is, in fact, over 90%. In Illinois, it's actually closer to 93, 94%. These plants can be run, if they're well engineered, and they had to actually be re-engineered, they can be run effectively and efficiently. It is the case that they are low carbon. They are a sustainable energy resource, meaning that the stuff that you use to fuel them is there in plenitude. And finally, if you look at the other alternatives, for example, think about coal and carbon sequestration, no one has really yet demonstrated that you can really sequester the CO2 from a coal-burning plant for the times that you need to sequester it, which are really centuries. If you ask which of the major energy resources has killed the most people, it happens to be coal. Just think of the mining accidents. Wind and solar, something that Amory did not mention, is that while it is intermittent because of wind, and there's the weather and, of course, the day-night cycle, these are at some level predictable. It is also the case in wind that windmills break. My wife and I just drove here from Chicago. We had the pleasure of driving through some of the western states, including Utah and Nevada. And it is remarkable when you go on I-80 how many windmills you see, windmills that were not there some 10 years ago. It's also interesting, if you do a number count, how many of the windmills are not working. That is, in some cases, their blades are turning. In the same farm, blades are not turning. And we counted something of the order between 10 and 20% of the mills were not turning. So it is not the case that they don't break. They also break. And biofuels, of course, the other issue is it's largely aimed at transportation, and I'm a huge supporter of using biofuels for transportation. So what about costs? You heard Amory hammer that over and over again. So let me just point out that not everybody will agree with his numbers. Take the New York Times. I don't think they're regarded as a wild-eyed nuke supporter. This is a graph from about 2 years ago where they showed that for a carbon cost equivalent of, it's hard for me to read, but something like $15 per ton of CO2 released, CO2 equivalent released, nuclear is in fact highly competitive. But the bottom line is actually, I agree with Amory's slide where he said that you really can't accurately compute the cost of a nuclear plant. I would contend that it's very difficult to compute the cost of any kind of plant today because of the uncertainties in the capital market. That is, we don't really know exactly how much money will cost in the future. And furthermore, the uncertainties in the construction industry. So whether or not something is going to be more or less expensive, I think, is really a matter of actually trying it out. And there are lots of experiments being done. As I mentioned before, there are a number of countries that are building, and we will know the construction costs from them. So what are the liabilities of nuclear, from my perspective, here in the United States? The first one is technological. And it has to do with something that has not been mentioned by Amory. He was kind enough not to mention it, but it has to be out on the table, which is that the United States has been extraordinarily inept about dealing with the spent nuclear fuel. Yucca Mountain is probably a dead issue. We've been working on that for decades. It looks like it's not going anywhere. The law says there shall not be any interim storage, but in fact, we do have de facto interim storage because all that stuff that's spent fuel is sitting in pools or in dry storage right next to the nuclear plants. So, and we seem not to be able to deal with that. I think we do have an issue about the next generation of plants. We would like to build new plants that are inherently safe. Inherently means passively safe. They don't rely on active safety systems. The problem is that these have not yet been demonstrated. So we have a development gap. There are economic limitations. This is, I think, the key issue that Amory mentioned, which is that the construction costs are highly uncertain. And one of the reasons they're particularly uncertain, which I didn't mention before, Amory did mention, is the fact that when you build a nuclear plant, you can't just use, for example, for the stainless steel plumbing that goes into such a plant, your local plumbers. This is a fact that the French, Areva, neglected to remember. They certainly should have known it in the plant that they're building in Finland, the very first new plant there in quite a while. There are 2 on order from Areva, and the first one is severely over budget because the folks that were pouring the concrete and the folks that were doing the plumbing basically were not properly trained. And so it is the case that we have a huge technology problem all over the world in not having the manpower, the technical manpower that's fully qualified to actually build the plants. This is a huge issue, and the folks, interestingly enough, that are addressing this up front are in fact the Chinese. Let me just also finally just mention the political limitation. There the issue is, of course, interim storage and just nervousness about and uncertainties about what does nuclear really mean for us. Certainly in the United States, that's probably the biggest uncertainty. Now, remember what I said in the beginning about R&D and the story I told you about the aircraft industry. This is a plot from Kelly Gallagher at Harvard that shows the level of investment that the United States government has done in things related to energy over time. And we spent a lot of money in the late 70s, and basically then we just crashed. And we're just starting to inch up again. This is, by the way, in constant dollars. So it is devastating that in the area where we really wanted to focus on, where it really makes a difference, especially as climate is concerned, we basically are not bothering to invest. So we should be worried. You should be worried. What's different now than say, in the 70s? The drivers are different. We have climate change. In the 70s, it wasn't a worry about. Energy security it really does now matter. Proliferation is a big issue now because all those folks building new plants. The technology has changed. There are new designs on the table. There is a way of thinking about building new kinds of plants, new generation of plants, 30, 40 years in the future. Not today, but basically mid-century, that are really different, that are not stick-built plants, that are factory-built plants that are delivered on site. The industry itself has evolved. It's become much more efficient. And it is the case that the rest of the world is experiencing a renaissance, no matter they're building. So let me just end by saying that, in my opinion, here in the United States, I'm not just a natural supporter of nuclear. There are certain preconditions in my mind that have to be fulfilled in order for nuclear to play a role in the United States. The first is we have to progress on things like storage. The second is if it is the case, as Amory argues, that the competing technologies are demonstrably cheaper than nuclear, then of course, why would you bother? And finally, we really do have to worry about the international forum. I think that if we do not have the technical capability to play a role, that will be devastating internationally. In my mind, that would be not just too bad, it would be disaster. So thank you.
Well, we have heard two excellent presentations, and before we hear point and rebuttal, I would like to call on Peter Darbee to give us his thoughts. You've spoken often and eloquently about climate change, so perhaps you could begin by sharing your current thinking and any new thoughts that you've had on that issue.
Sure. I think back in 2005, PG&E shocked the corporate world and many others by coming out and saying at that time that we had met with a panel of scientists on both sides of the issue, and we had challenged those scientists over a period of months. And the conclusions we reached from that was the Earth is warming, mankind is responsible, and the need for action is now. One of the scientists that I found very compelling in that discussion was Bob Corral, who had been working on the problem for quite a long time. And I was distressed recently to receive an email from him regarding his assessment of climate change and his review of the work that had been done by the UN experts and scientists on the question of climate change, which indicated that it is occurring much more rapidly than people had anticipated, that the consequences are much more profound, and frankly, raising really to crisis proportions the outlook for climate change. So it only went to reinforce my urgency that this is something that we as people need to deal with, PG&E as a company needs to deal with, our country and our planet needs to deal with.
But what about the role of nuclear power in that? You've heard two views that differ significantly. What's your thinking on the role of nuclear power?
Back in, I think it was 2005 or 2006, I was invited to go to the pit at GE. Some of you may be familiar with their Crotonville facility. And we got together with Jeff Immelt and then also many of the top CEOs in the country in energy and electric utilities. And during that time, we had a discussion of all of the alternatives, clean coal, natural gas-fired turbines, the latest technology, renewables, and also nuclear energy. And of course, GE plays across, I believe, just about all of those sectors.
Absolutely.
And during that, we did a lot of interesting electronic voting where not only could I draw conclusions from the different presentations, but we could see the votes of our colleagues in terms of how they viewed the alternatives. And when all was said and done, the conclusion that I came to, but also many of the other CEOs, was that as you look out, no one technology looked like the clear right answer. And so being a pragmatist as I am, I concluded for our company that we had to put the chips across many different technologies and alternatives to make them work and to position the company appropriately.
And where is PG&E now in terms of its diversification and its spreading of its investment?
We emit 50% of the carbon per megawatt or kilowatt hour of the average utility in the United States. So we have a tremendously clean portfolio, and we're continuing to make it more clean all the time. And by the way, energy efficiency is the best alternative and the least cost alternative, and so that's the first place we go. We do have an excellent nuclear facility. It's 2,200 megawatts. It's located in San Luis Obispo. Its name is Diablo Canyon. It runs very reliably. It's one of the best running nuclear facilities in the country. We have an orientation where we will keep that running as long as it makes sense, because it's clean power and it costs about 3 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's excellent in that regard. I've made the decision to date that for PG&E, the best solution is to keep that running, but not to build another power plant at this time. The reason is I think we're going to pursue alternatives with respect to energy efficiency and renewables, as well as demand management and the smart grid. And the belief is that we are in excellent territory when it comes to renewables, and so we're really pushing that. And what we've concluded in this state, it's what our customers want, our regulators want, public policy makers, and I feel it's the best solution also for our shareholders. So that's the conclusion we've reached in California, but in other states in the Southeast, for example, where customers and regulators might feel differently and the opportunities for renewable power may be less, I recognize that they may come to a different conclusion and be supportive of nuclear.
Well, let me ask the first set of questions, and for truth and advertising purposes, Lionel had a Freudian slip and introduced me originally as Carl Sagan before he corrected himself. I am not Carl Sagan's son, although I've been asked that question billions and billions of times. But like the late Dr. Sagan, I am very interested in both the future of the world climate and the future of international security and nuclear weapons issues. And with the exception of Bob Rosner's last slide, very little was said about the security implications globally of the potential spread of nuclear power. And here I would note and recommend to all of you the next issue of Daedalus on the nuclear future. The Daedalus is the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The next issue will appear on newsstands next week, actually, on the future of nuclear weapons and nuclear power, and notes that some 50 countries have asked the IAEA for assistance in helping them decide whether Amory or Bob is right, helping them decide should they acquire nuclear power, and that our common term, the Renaissance in nuclear power, does not differentiate importantly between two different phenomena: the spread of nuclear power to new countries and the expansion of nuclear power in existing nuclear power states. And if you take the countries that are aspiring, or at least ask the IAEA, and as a political scientist, look at their characteristics, you'll find, as this Daedalus issue shows, that they have far lower political stability on the whole. Right. They have lower regulatory competence, as measured by the World Bank. They have higher terrorism rates, as measured by the State Department data set. And so the spread of nuclear power, as opposed to the expansion of nuclear power, creates a whole set of non-proliferation and security issues as we move forward. So I'd be interested in hearing your views about what are some of the things that, how does the security aspect influence your judgments about the future, and especially from a leader of industry, what can the United States industry do that can potentially address some of the security issues globally? So who'd like to respond on the security issues?
I
All
think
three.
you've really raised a good point, and when you're talking about the instability of governments, that's a real concern. So it's important to differentiate between expansion, as you indicated, which I think is something that needs to be part of the solution to climate change in the United States. Certainly, if you look at the Sokolov prism and the prism that EPRI uses, we have big challenges, and there's a role there. But we need to be very, very careful as it relates to the spread to less stable governments, because what we've seen in the past is that the U.S. backs one government, and then there's a different one in the future, and they can be very hostile to our interests and also to the values that we live. And so that should be a real concern. INPO, the industry association in the United States, over nuclear industry, has done a very good job of raising the standards and getting good safety and performance. And certainly, expanding that approach internationally through WANO, the international affiliate, is a good opportunity. But I think we do have to step back and look at the evaluation of those societies and countries, just as you have, and ask ourselves, are certain countries out of consideration?
Right, and the physical security equivalent of WANO is the newly formed World Institute for Nuclear Security in Vienna, which is bringing the operators together and the security personnel to share best practices. But it's just taking off. It's not a long-standing view, so there's a lot of very interesting work that Americans with these international partners can do there. Bob, and then Amory.
Yeah, I think this last point, I think, is absolutely crucial. If you ask of what value is the nuclear industry to the United States, one is, of course, the obvious that it's part of the power equation. The other one is, in fact, exactly in the direction of what happens to nuclear spread worldwide. The fact that the American nuclear industry is so well organized, that it's done such a good job of improving the safety record, it speaks volumes about what we're capable of doing, what we're capable of giving away, if you like, which is expertise. And it is a much better way, in my view, than of demonstrating and influencing the rest of the world than what the United States has unfortunately done in the past, which is basically to tell people how to behave. It's singularly, it's been quite an experience for me to meet folks from other countries who are involved, for example, in their nuclear programs. For example, the folks in Switzerland, who I don't think you normally think of as rabidly anti-American, who have some very pungent things to say about our behavior with the IAEA, that we're basically overbearing, that we always tell other people what to do, but don't really listen to other people and their concerns. And so being able to demonstrate by practice how to operate things safely, perhaps even for the American industry to get involved in operating nuclear plants in these kinds of countries that we're just talking about, where you provide the personnel, the experience, are things to think about and are an important component of why we in the United States do need to maintain some experience in the nuclear area.
Amory?
I think any thoughtful analyst of energy options would say it's been obvious for over 30 years that the two really big problems, the ways energy could do us in, besides oil security and instability, are climate change and nuclear proliferation. And you don't want to trade those off for each other. You want to avoid all of those problems. I think having written several books on proliferation and probably dozens of technical papers. I think it's clear also that the main driver in the spread of nuclear weapons is that countries like the U.S. and France, with very strong historic government support, are providing or even giving away or paying people to take do-it-yourself bomb kits, which are wrapped in innocent-looking civilian disguise. That is, the materials, equipment, skills, technologies, and cadres of skilled people that go with the nuclear power program also provide nuclear weapons capability, and you can claim, like Iran, that you're just making electricity. But imagine that we took economics seriously and did the cheapest things first. I'll say in a minute who "we" is. In that case, the bomb ingredients would no longer be ordinary items of commerce, so they would be harder to get, more conspicuous to try to get, and politically much costlier to be caught trying to get, because there would be no doubt what you're up to. This disambiguation would not make proliferation impossible, but it would make it a lot harder, and we'd be more likely to notice in time because we could concentrate scarce intelligence resources on needles, not haystacks. Here, therefore, although I agreed with a great deal that Bob said, I think we depart on the U.S. role. The operator sharing thing may be a very good idea if other countries want it. But think about our political example in our energy policy. If a country with our wealth in fuels, technology, and money says we have to have nuclear power going forward, that's an open invitation for any other country lacking any or all of those advantages to say the same thing. Imagine instead, however, that we look back at the bargain in Article 4 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which comes up for review next year, and said, let's look at this through the lens of our new domestic energy policy, emphasizing efficiency and renewables, because the bargain that entitled developing countries adherent to the treaty to access to nuclear technology for purely peaceful purposes, if there is such a thing, that was written by nuclear experts in a nuclear context at a time when nuclear power was generally believed to be indispensable and cheap. We now know better. We now have abundant empirical evidence, not just in the U.S., but in many countries, including many developing countries, that there are much cheaper solutions. In fact, developing countries will soon dominate the renewable additions worldwide. So suppose we said, actually, the purpose of Article 4 was to provide reliable and affordable energy for development, and we're going to help anybody that wants to do that. Call it sunbeams for peace if you want. It's a smarter idea than atoms for peace. We'll help anybody that wants to do that, and if somebody wants specifically nuclear energy, let them explain why they want the costliest option. Probably it's not about energy. I think that would help smoke out the proliferators.
Interesting. The Article 4 of the NPT, however, was not written by nuclear engineers. It was written by international lawyers. And they used the 18th century language, unfortunately in my view, of natural rights, saying that countries have an inalienable right, quoting from the Declaration of Independence, as if people should have life, liberty, and the pursuit of plutonium as their right, to borrow Albert Wohlsetter's phrase. Internationally, as we see with the crisis with Iran, there are many politicians and industry leaders in other countries who say you can't restrict that right. Can you give thoughts about how internationally scientists, leaders, business people are reacting to your various positions? Not how this audience or how an American audience does, but how it's going internationally.
Well, I work in about 50 countries and have generally a very warm reception, particularly from business leaders who notice that I'm helping them make more money by doing the cheapest things first, and that also happens to improve security and fix the climate problem.
Bob?
Yeah, I had the pleasure of meeting Jose Golenberg, who is, of course, the energy minister for the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And he had a very interesting statement to make at a meeting that we had in Chicago, which is that he thought that it was very presumptuous for the U.S. to think that we were going to tell Brazil what to do. And that From his point of view and from Brazil's perspective, we had a very different ranking of priorities than they do. In particular, climate change is not at the top of their priority. At the top of their priority is the living standard of their population. Jose also said that he thought it was presumptuous for American companies to think that they were going to dominate the building market. That, thank you very much, we have companies in Brazil that are perfectly capable of building the plants and running the plants. So I think the issue is, just what I said earlier, that the United States, unfortunately, has a history of being presumptuous about telling other people what they ought to be doing. And that's resented elsewhere, and in fact, it's gotten to a position, even in cases where we think we have a good idea, it's often not accepted, precisely because we've been such bad actors in the past. So that's a real challenge when we think about things nuclear and proliferation.
Absolutely. Peter.
The responses have varied from region to region. We have entertained discussions with the Chinese with respect to energy efficiency, and they first came to see what we were doing at PG&E and in California on energy efficiency, and then we sent delegations there. What became clear to me is prior to them developing a more positive view about the issue of climate change, they saw it as a world competitiveness issue, and they saw that they were very, very wasteful on the use of energy, and what they could do is become far more competitive by pursuing energy efficiency rapidly. And so that was the first thing that we saw. The second thing...
Yeah, and in fact, Peter, on that point, they pay 3 times the share of GDP for electricity that we do.
And they saw that it was increasing rather than decreasing when we first spoke with them, and so they said this is going to drive our economy into the ground. What is interesting is we've observed that they are moving rapidly on solar panel manufacturing, that they have moved rapidly on battery technology for electric cars, and in fact are moving rapidly on electric car production. And so what the conclusion that I came to, interestingly, was the same one that Thomas Friedman has come to, and we met last week in Washington for breakfast, and he started telling me about the article he was going to write on Saturday or Sunday, and I said, we're seeing exactly the same thing. So it was interesting, from 2 different places, we came together, Tom Friedman and myself, to exactly the same point. One of the things that's good about this conversation is that we're not all talking past each other, but there are many points where we agree and disagree. One thing that is really important for me to bring out is an area where Amory and I aren't quite seeing the world the same, and it bridges the 2 poles here, or points of view. And that is, on energy efficiency, we are seeing the numbers at about 3 cents a kilowatt hour, or maybe 4 cents a kilowatt hour. But on renewables, we're seeing the cost of renewables far higher than what Amory showed from Lazard. And we are in the market every day for we contract for more renewable power than anybody in the country. And the prices that we're seeing are far higher than what was up there in Lazard. So it used to be for wind power 6 to 8 cents a kilowatt hour. Then it was 8 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Now it's north of 10, maybe to 12 cents a kilowatt hour. If you're looking for solar power, I go to all these panel discussions where people say, oh yeah, it's 6 to 8 cents, we can come in there. But when we're actually there doing the contract, it may be now 15 to 20 cents a kilowatt hour. And what we're seeing also with so many of the renewable players that we had in light of what happened with the financial crisis is that they're saying, well, we tried, we couldn't make it, we're not going to be able to honor that contract, let's renegotiate. And it's even higher. But probably the biggest issue that touches on nuclear and the renewable development is the roadblocks of government. Yes. They are incomprehensible. And so it's taking 8 years to bring a clean renewable project to market. And government has to get out of the way and start helping rather than standing in the way. What we have is a coalition of government entities all operating independently and creating obstacle after obstacle. And we have done business cases on it and presented it to the PUC as well as to Sacramento and the governor's office, and they look at this and say, we see we're the problem. The problem that we have is nobody in government to date has taken accountability for fixing the problem. Somebody from government has to step in there and start, chastising and bringing power on these agencies to be accountable. Let me give you a case in point. A developer was working on a program for 7 or 8 years, trying to bring their projects to market. And one of the regulatory agencies out there filed an appeal after 7 years, that they've been working on it. So when asked, well, why did you file an appeal? The response, it was in the last 15 minutes before their time ran out. They said, well, in the last 2 years, we haven't had time to get around and look at this, so we filed an appeal to drag it out even more. I mean, that's the grossly irresponsible behavior of government agencies, and it has to end today if we're going to fix this problem.
Who is going to be that person other than yourselves? What government, is this a czar? Is this done inside the White House? What thoughts do you have on how to fix that government regulation decision-making process?
I think that the governor of a state ought to have the responsibility for disciplining and aligning the agencies under his authority in the state, and that we ought to pick a lead agency that has the accountability for driving the other agencies. Let's not create another government bureaucracy. That just slows things down. And at the federal level, I think we ought to give FERC the responsibility for pushing the development and expediting things. So, for example, on transmission, we could have the siting capability with FERC and grant it to it that we do with pipelines that have been very successful.
Bob, and last comment to Amory, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A from the audience.
I couldn't agree more with you. I agree that FERC should take the lead. I think one of the issues that we have is that in things nuclear, because of the Cold War and the weapons program, the responsibility for nuclear energy, sits with a different agency. It does not sit with FERC, it sits with the NRC. And of course, the NRC has, as all bureaucracies, has a life of its own and a will to live. And I think that's really the problem with all of these issues, that the agencies have a will to live, they want to continue to exist, and they will assert that will. And that's the problem. And quite frankly, I don't think we have a very good record of dealing with that.
Amory?
I have every sympathy, Peter, with your point of view, and I think I'd come to pretty similar conclusions, not, however, on cost. I think you're in a rather unusual situation because you and some other California large utilities have bought so much renewable so fast for so long that you're probably looking at some market bottlenecks and using up the best sites, as well as all the incredible bureaucratic delays you talk about. For what it's worth, you were talking about 6, 8, 10, 12 cent wind power. The national average for new wind farms that went online last year was 5.15 cents a kilowatt hour, net of a production tax credit smaller than the subsidies the coal and nuclear get, and it's worth about 1 cent a kilowatt hour levelized after tax. The cost of firming wind power, so it's available whether the wind's blowing or not, which Bob, you said was very high, averages about 0.3, 0.4 cents a kilowatt hour. And there are over 13 utility studies now in the U.S. Showing roughly that range, always under a half cent. In other words, it's a few percent addition to cost. And the funny thing is, it's probably less than the reserve margin, spinning reserve and such that you need to firm the intermittent large thermal plants. Let me put it another way. If you properly diversify different renewables, because say the weather that's bad for wind is good for sun and vice versa, and if you put them in different places so they see different weather, and if you forecast them, which we're pretty good at, it's called weather forecasting, more predictable than demand, and if you then integrate them with the supply side and demand side resources now on the grid, you probably end up needing less storage and backup than we've already installed and paid for to cope with the intermittence of the big thermal plants that can drop out 1 billion watts in a few milliseconds for weeks or months without warning. The variable renewables have to be operated properly. but this is routinely done in other parts of the world. In fact, there are 5 German states now that get 30 to 40% of their annual electricity from wind, more than 100% at windy times, and they operate without difficulty, same in parts of Spain and Denmark. It took a while for the operators to figure this out and get comfortable with it. Now they are, and it's routine. Just like we cope with the intermittence of plants that back each other up, just the way we cope with fluctuating demand. It's just a different way of thinking about how to run your system.
Very brief responses from both of you. Bob and then
So 2 responses. First, about the cost issue. In the case of thermal plants, the intermittency costs are already built into the rate base. In the case of wind and solar, they are not. For example, who pays for the build-out of the transmission network that you would need in order to actually do the kinds of things that you're saying? Technologically, it's possible, but it's not paid for by the folks that actually are building the wind farms or the solar.
I would put it the other way, as we did in the discussion with John Wellingoff last night, and I think he agrees with this, that the incumbents got their lines paid for by the ratepayers or by the federal taxpayers, and now they're asking new competitors coming to market to pay for their own lines. That's not fair. You ought to have a level playing field.
you got your second point, Bob, and then Peter.
The second has to do with Germany. So what you say is quite correct, that wind is playing a very large role there. However, the Germans have a safety backup that we do not have. They have France next to them.
They have
and in
what?
fact, they have France next to them. And in fact, history has shown that they import quite a bit of power from the French, and of course, those are nuclear electrons, if you like.
They also export a great deal of coal power to France with the carbon bill charged to Germany, not France, because in order to soak up their nuclear surplus, France had to heavily promote electric heating, so now their winter peak is 3 times their summer peak, and they can't meet it, so they're having to bring oil plants out of mothballs and build new fossil plants. So I think we agree they've overbuilt.
Right.
Peter, absolute last word before we get to questions.
You know, transmission is really important to move in the direction that Amory has described. I've seen 2 CEOs honored for 10 years of work to build just a 250-mile transmission line. 10 years, and they were viewed as heroes for getting it done. We're looking at the prospect of a 1,200-mile transmission line to British Columbia in Canada, and it has to be easier than it is. We need to get government helping us rather than standing in the way.
But of course, efficiency and distributed generation don't need transmission because they're already delivered, and they free up existing grid capacity. So that's another benefit I think we'd all agree about.
My effort to get the last word before we turn to questions is always difficult, but I want to do that now. So we have 2 microphones going around. I would like, when you get the microphone, to identify yourself and ask a brief question to one or more than one of the panelists. I want to underscore 2 of the words in that plea. One is brief question. That means it's not a statement. It's 1 or 2 sentences without a whole lot of semicolons in the middle of your sentence. And I want to underscore the word question. That means there's a question mark at the end of your statement. That doesn't mean, don't you agree with me? It means the sentence itself has a question mark. I can't see the microphone out there. They're running. So one's back there, so could you give it to the individual in the back raising his hand there? And please identify yourself and ask a brief question.
Yep. Hello, Yevra Ornstein, Solar Lease from New Zealand. There was a slide, Amory, you had from SunPower, I believe, with a timeline comparing PV, output, costs, et cetera, comparing to the construction of nuclear energy. Is there anything like that that compares PV performance over a timeline vis-a-vis hydroelectric dam construction, comparing the 2?
No, the comparisons that Tom did, maybe Tom's here if you want to get with him offline about it, was just between new photovoltaic utility scale plant and new combined cycle gas or coal or nuclear.
Wait for the mic so you can...
I don't know of anything like that for hydroelectric, but you could easily construct one. It's a standard cash flow analysis.
Okay. Please, right here in the front.
Hi, my name is Allison Wellsfree, And the question is for Peter Darbee. Amory Lovins yesterday, or a couple days ago on the national NPR radio interview, mentioned home users using renewable energy of some sort and being able to put energy back into the grid. And I think you mentioned that that was already happening in some states. I don't think that that's happening in California. Can you tell me your thoughts on that, where that might be going?
I just want to make sure I understood the question correctly, because what is happening today is there are many rooftop solar installations in California, and that power is being sold into the grid. You know, we pay for it and it goes into the grid.
California is one of 30-odd states where you can, in essence, run your meter backwards. There's a lot of disagreement about the fine print, because in most states there's some restriction on how much you can do that, and commonly in this state, if you actually make more than you use and you have a surplus over the course of a month or a year, you may not get paid for the surplus, you have to give it away. On the other hand, Peter would probably argue he's paying way over the odds for what he does buy from you, so that we would need a general look at who pays whom for what to get it fair to both parties, and there ought to be a middle ground there.
In reality is with the tiered pricing structure in California, the highest tier is 45 cents a kilowatt hour. So when people reduce their bills from that, we effectively are paying 45 cents a kilowatt hour for that power, which is a lot more than Amory would suggest is market price. So we have been supportive of solar rooftops, but we would also argue that the economic model is not right. It really undermines the existing utilities, and the time has probably come to revisit that model, and let's get it right. Because whenever you have something that undermines the incumbents, it's hard for them to be real enthusiastic, and many incumbents might fight it. And we should create a mechanism where we're all pulling together, just as we do with energy efficiency.
In Colorado, I pay 7 or 8 cents a kilowatt hour. I used to get that when I sold my solar surplus back to my co-op. Now they only pay me 3-odd, but it's still fun to watch the meter go backwards, to know that my house stays on with or without the grid, and to know that I'm taking coal off the grid.
Right. A question in the middle here. Oh, I'm sorry, right here, please.
Hello, my name is Leslie Soames, and I've spent about 30 years in the field helping large clients figure out how to finance the upgrade of their utility systems. And without exception, to do energy efficiency, to do any kind of investment structure, you're going to need people who understand the deal. And most customers aren't interested in energy efficiency and being an energy supplier unless it impacts their bottom line. So our solution to that, and possibly a solution I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about, is to take these business investment plans and create a web-based, real-time application. That's a standard tool that can be used as a communication medium to close deals, to understand why utilities and service companies are bringing value to these projects, and to be able to track them in a dynamic marketplace among all the many, many stakeholders who tend to shoot themselves in the foot. So I'm interested, in your thoughts about this idea.
Okay. We're doing a lot with respect to the question of educating and informing people, and also working towards tools like that. Amory and I were just discussing earlier today, in different territories there have been tools developed. The way things work in California today, at least the vision, is that we make more money by selling less power. That's because of decoupling and then the energy efficiency incentives. So we spend a lot of our time, particularly with our large commercial customers, pointing out electric motors and things like that that ought to be replaced, lighting, refrigeration and all. And they love it when we do that. There is no company out there in the world that I know that actually encourages its customers to use less of the product. They may give you 50% off to buy more, but people really enjoy the fact where we're trying to reduce their energy bills. So right now, with all the changes that are occurring, we're trying to do thousands of things simultaneously, and it's a real challenge, but we'd like to move in that direction. For example, the vision that I came up with was that we would create a website whereby we could refer our customers to it after we do an energy audit, and on it would be the different types of contractors that they might have available to them. And what we would do is we'd provide the feedback from customers regarding how those vendors were doing, and it would be constantly updated so you could see the votes of the customers regarding their customer satisfaction on the work that those vendors are doing. So I think we want to move in that direction. It's a question of how many things we can do simultaneously.
Yeah, in fact, the previous head of PG&E's biggest and best efficiency program in the world is my predecessor as chairman of RMI, John C. Fox. And if some of you come to the panel that our trustee Arjun Gupta will chair tomorrow afternoon, I believe, on investment opportunities and progress, Jack Hittery is on that panel, and he can tell you about an extraordinary piece of software, globalsolarcenter.com, that Peter and I were just discussing.
I think we should move over to here on this side, please.
Dylan Lanius, I'm currently unaffiliated. I had a question for the panel, primarily Peter Darbee. Looking at the social interest of micropower, as Amory terms it, there is obviously emphasis on energy efficiency and distributed power generation, which we need to play into the utilities, who are clearly the regulatory, with the regulatory structure of the primary parties in the energy business. So how do they go about their demand side management profitably for their shareholders? And then how do they deal with the net metering and sort of small independent power producers, which are currently proliferating those type of decentralized power generation facilities? Is that integrated, or how does that play out?
Okay. This is something that we're looking at and spending a lot of time on right now. The first thought I have is I've been like an evangelist together with Ralph Cavanagh of NRDC going around the country saying to policymakers, you need to understand that utilities are big and powerful and they have a lot of people. And if they make less money by selling less power, they will continually sell more power. So you need to get the incentives right. It's the most important thing that I can do, Ralph can do, anyone, is convince policymakers, let utilities make more money by selling less power, by working with their customers to see how they can use less.
In other words, reward you for cutting customers' bills, not for selling them more energy.
And in California, we have it almost right in that we have decoupling, which is indisputable a good thing. There are a lot of people in California who feel we should just order the utilities to do this, and that's a bad idea because it's like pulling a mule along. They don't work well. If you put the incentives out there, that's fine. And so the problem is within the commission, the Public Utilities Commission, you can see a difference of philosophy. The president of the commission, Michael Peavy, understands how you should have incentives, clear incentives, and meaningful incentives. But there have been different people with different views that have tried to distort it, such that in the last year, when we were trying to get our energy incentives, we exceeded the target substantially, but there were members of the staff who argued we should get zero payments. And NRDC came in and audited what we did, as well as Edison, and said they exceeded the target substantially, they should get the full incentives. And it was a terrible debate among the commission. And, for those of you in the business world, give me the incentives, make the rules clear, and then I'll run like a horse, a thoroughbred for it. But if you change the rules during the game, you leave the people confused.
Yeah.
So that's really important for energy efficiency as we go forward. On the net metering issue, the problem that we have is that we're paying as much as 45 cents a kilowatt hour for power. And what happens is when we pay that, The cost of that is spread among our remaining customers, and so their rates go higher and higher. We currently have a freeze for rate structure 1 and 2 in the state, which has been in place for years now. And so the cost of power for people who want to put rooftops on is very, very expensive. And what happens is the municipalities and the irrigation districts come in and say, you know, PG&E is very inefficient. Their costs are so high. Well, they're so high because there hasn't been a level playing field, that the munis haven't been faced with the same rules. The irrigations districts haven't. And so we pay 45 cents for power. It causes everybody's rates, the remaining customers' rates, to go up. And then we're viewed as uncompetitive. And so the city of San Francisco tried to take over our business last year, saying we were wholly inefficient. So, you know, what I really like about Amory's approach is it's very thoughtful. And rather than saying you're wrong, PG&E, he said, you're right. We got to have the economic model right, because you're not going to wholeheartedly pursue something that destroys your business. And destroying our business is not in the interests of you, our customers, broadly, regulators. We saw that happen in the energy crisis, and it was not a good place to be. So what I've pledged to do with the president of the commission is, I think now is the time that we should relook how we fund in California the solar panels, which I'm very much in favor of, you know, the rooftop. But we have to design it in a way that it works for everybody involved. So we're pulling together, not pulling apart.
Fortunately, if you start counting some of the distributed benefits in our Economist book of the year 2002 called Small is Profitable, those make the photovoltaics about 10 times more valuable than we thought. So there's plenty of money to go around.
Let's take a question. Where's the microphone? I can see it over here. Right here? Is there someone?
I have a person.
Yes, okay, please.
I'm Jeff Kiak. I work for Kaiser Permanente. And Mr. Darby, first I'd like to thank you for your continuing partnership. We heard that the prices for renewables are not what we had originally expected, and that we know that these higher costs are subsidized with federal tax credits and PUC incentives that the utility company gets to pass along. So I'm curious, with those increasing costs for renewables, what does that say about the future of renewables and renewable development?
Well, if you look at the terrific Wasser and Bollinger report last year from Berkeley Lab on the status of the wind industry, you'll find there has been a rise in wind turbine prices the last few years. Some of it was made up by better operations, as say with nuclear. Some was not. There was a net uptick in cost. It was 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour, then 4.8, then 5.15 last year. So the last 3 years there's been that rise. But that's quite clearly because of bottlenecking. The wind business is growing 20 or 30% a year. We're running out of gearboxes and stuff like that. And industry does catch up with that kind of thing. And there are already signs that a lot of the cost pressure was abating. In fact, a lot of it was from the weak dollar, because we import over half our turbines from places like Denmark. In the case of photovoltaics, it's the opposite pattern. There was a little squeeze for a while with a silicon shortage. That's now been relieved. The cost of photovoltaic modules dropped by about a quarter in the past year, and it's following the historic experience curve again. So most renewables are getting cheaper. Wind was temporarily bottlenecked, and the general pattern is that big plants are getting more expensive. Renewables and efficiency are getting less expensive.
Let me say something that is supportive of what Amory has said, and that is what we saw in the latest RFP that we've done for renewables is we had 3 times the response back than we had in the prior RFP. And so what may have happened is there may have been a bottleneck that drove prices up high, then supply has increased and they may come down. I hope that is the case, because as I say, there's a big gulf between the prices we're seeing in the marketplace every day and what Amory describes. And so I'd love to kind of work with him on it to kind of reconcile the two.
Yeah.
Let me just say
but I think we both use empirical data. That's the important thing to know. We do not use unsourced New York Times graphs. Sorry.
That was a cheap shot, I'll say in the middle.
Yes.
Let me just say that for Kaiser, I've met with your CEO, and he's a very thoughtful, great intellectual And you're lucky to have a good CEO like him.
Yeah.
Question from over here.
Hi, Dave Houghton, engineer. It's commonly assumed that nuclear power has zero carbon emissions. However, there's been studies that show that through the design, construction cycle, fuel handling, decommissioning, there actually is a significant amount of carbon emission. And so I wonder if you would comment, is that a significant consideration in this debate? And to be fair, how do solar and wind shake out in that same light?
So if you add the construction and exterior things, not the plant itself in terms of
And
operation.
enrichment. Yeah, I actually wrote half a book on this subject in '77, and there's an excellent energy policy review paper by Benjamin Sovacool in Singapore looking at over 100 studies of this. The basic conclusion is that carbon emissions are probably a good deal higher than the nuclear industry says. They're probably comparable well, they're actually a bit more than wind or photovoltaics, less than combined cycle gas. I'm comfortable with those numbers. It's not an important part of the debate. If you want to show very large carbon emissions for nuclear, you can do it by assuming even a small energy investment over a very, very long time to look after the waste. But we don't really know how we're going to do that anyway and whether it takes energy.
Comment on that aspect of nuclear power? Do you agree that it's not a...
I don't, yeah, I agree with Amory. I think there is a carbon cost, and it's not a significant issue.
Yeah, what we ought to focus on is the economics, and I absolutely agree with the climate urgency that Peter expressed, and I think was largely implicit in Bob's remarks. Right. And to my mind, that reinforces the importance of investing judiciously, not indiscriminately, to get the most climate solution per dollar and the most climate solution per year. That's what my whole
But you also agree that in addition to the economics, you need to also add the security implications of these various...
But I think that all leads in the same direction. That is, the technologies that have lowest cost, lowest financial risk, and are best succeeding in the market also happen to be nonviolent and to smoke out proliferators.
You know, I just want to add that what is important is to put a price on carbon and to do so as quickly as possible. And of course, that's what the Waxman-Markey bill proposed, and PG&E has been a key player in terms of trying to craft that and get support for that. And now we have to see what, we'll develop with the Boxer bill, and that's why I intend to be back in Washington 3 out of 4 weeks in October alone.
Very good.
I just want to express the gratitude we all feel, Peter, for your leadership on this issue.
I totally agree with that.
I believe we have time for one more question, so please.
Thank you very much. This is Jay Ogilvie, Dean at Presidio Graduate School. I want to thank you all for looking at nuclear not as a kind of religious issue, nuclear good, nuclear bad, also for appreciating we're not just talking about nuclear in the U.S., but anywhere in the world. What I gather from all three of you is that the political issue is paramount and that a little autocracy goes a long way when you're building nuclear plants. Now, in light of that, what would any of you on the panel say to the proposal that France, the U.S., and Japan combine in a coalition to invest intellectual, financial, and manufacturing resources in building a nuclear power energy in China?
I don't think we would do it as cheaply or as fast or possibly as well as China is doing. For what it's worth, I just visited that troubled Finnish project as a guest of the CEO of Areva, and had some very interesting conversations with their COO. I think they now better understand who their competitors are, but there will be data published shortly showing that even though France, by many reckonings, did everything right as much as possible on how to manage their nuclear program, it turns out they still had major cost and construction time escalation, pretty much like everybody else. It's just that they never admitted it before, but now their own data show that.
Bob, last word?
Yeah, I did spend some time in China on exactly that issue. I think the question that you're asking, unfortunately, is coming too late. Areva actually built the first plant in Daya Bay, And the Chinese basically use that as a template to build more plants. In fact, the plants that China are building are basically the French design. And the Chinese are really basically, they're not really interested in having folks come in and do things for them, except by basically demonstrating the technology to them, which then they co-opt. That's what they've been doing. That's what they'll continue to do. And this is, again, a case where we have very little leverage on what they do.
Well, we will take a break for 30 minutes for coffee and conversation and meet back here at 11. Join me in thanking the panel for such an interesting discussion.